All right, what's going on, everyone? Today we're going to talk about kill zones in Gaza. This is the focus of a recent article in Haaretz, which I'm only going to say that word once because I constantly mispronounce it. I'll link the article in the description below as well as a free version because they so kindly paywalled all of their content not too long ago, so you can read the whole thing if interested. Look, bottom line up front, after reading through this and going through the details, it looks like they're taking standard military procedures and making it seem like something inherently evil that only Israel does. So we'll add a little bit of context, some military context to what is actually playing out here. That said, there's also some examples they raise which are pretty troubling, and there's no good way to explain some of the acts as relayed by Israeli soldiers, which means that, this is one of those videos where I can never tell who's going to be upset in the comments. Like it's just not going to make everybody happy because it's just going to come from every direction. But you can't do this with thin skin. Learn that the hard way. All right, starting out, I do want to add some caveats to kind of keep in mind as we're getting through this article. The first is that an individual soldier's experience on the battlefield cannot be extrapolated out to the entire war. If we do that, we're setting ourselves up for failure. It's not unique to Gaza. In fact, if you look at the initial attack that Hamas carried out on October 7th, when some of their fighters moved back into Gaza, a handful were adamant and very vocal that they only attacked police and military forces and military infrastructure. And that same day, they were also, other portions of Hamas were releasing footage where it was pretty obvious that they were deliberately attacking civilians. So that one Hamas militant's view that he went in and only attacked IDF forces, it was accurate from his point of view, right? It did not tell the whole story from October 7th. The same thing plays out with IDF soldiers in Gaza as well as military forces around the world. So we have to keep that in mind. That said, again, there are incidents brought up throughout this article where even if it's not reflective of the entire military, the fact that it happens once is a problem and something that needs to be discussed. There's also a point here that Haaretz kind of had towards the end of the article, and I wish they would have brought it right up top because it really kind of lays the perfect context for all of these difficult decisions in the middle of a war zone, which that's really what this is armchair quarterbacking, game time decisions that people are having to make in the middle of life or death situations. In the article, they said, quote, "There is always tension between protecting our forces," this is coming from an Israeli officer, "which is the highest priority, and a situation in which you try to avoid unnecessary killing of civilians." And we're going to come back to that because, look, war sucks. That's just it. In war, people die. And in the perfect war, which doesn't exist, it would only be military forces. And even then, it sucks. But in all wars for a long time now, innocent people die as well. And the constant challenge of any force that we ask, of any force that is conducting lethal force on our behalf, right? As citizens of a nation, we're asking that they do their absolute best to differentiate militants and civilians, but it is never perfect. So starting out here, what I'm going to do is read through some of these statements in the piece, and then see how I didn't say the name of the publication. I'm going to avoid it intentionally. I'm going to trip up on it, no matter how many times I practice before I get into it. So we're going to read through a couple of the statements, and then I'll add a little bit of context. So starting out, they say the number of dead Gazans is now estimated to be over 32,000. According to the Army, some 9,000 of these are terrorists. And the term used throughout here is terrorist, not militant, not combatant, not personnel or whatever. So that's what we're going to go with, just kind of keep consistency throughout this analysis. They say, however, a host of reserve and standing Army commanders who have talked to Haaretz, thought I was going to get away with not saying that again, cast doubt on the claim that all of these were terrorists. They imply that the definition of a terrorist is open to a wide range of interpretation. It's quite possible that Palestinians who never held a gun in their lives were elevated to the rank of terrorist posthumously, at least by the IDF. So there's a couple ways that we have to look at this. The major one here is the intentional versus the unintentional categorization of these casualties. So if someone is very clearly a civilian, they're killed, and then after the fact, Israel labels them a terrorist, that's a problem. That's a war crime. That's intentionally targeting civilians. There's no good aspect of that at all. That is inexcusable. There's another side here, and because this article talks about a wide range of interpretation for who is a terrorist, like somebody moving with a backpack between a series of buildings that is delivering ammunition two fighters that are attacking Israeli forces, it's pretty clear that person is taking part in hostilities, right? So if they're killed, that person, that runner, is killed on a return trip after they dropped off the ammunition, and you go up there, you check out the casualty, and he's got an empty backpack, it could look, in a sense, like an innocent civilian was killed. And he wasn't carrying a weapon, didn't have a weapon on him or any military equipment whatsoever, just a backpack, right? But it's a tough call. What do you do there? You can't tell from a distance if there's ammunition or not in the backpack. It's one of those judgment calls on the battlefield. You have to think about the impact of any commander from any force in the middle of a war zone having to make these decisions. In that situation, you see somebody, maybe even a kid, running back and forth to a building that is continually firing on your forces. Do you let them go and potentially risk your own soldiers being killed in that firefight? Or do you make the judgment call based off of what you've seen on the battlefield and throughout your career to say it looks an awful lot like that is resupply coming in to keep the enemy forces in the fight, and you eliminate that threat? Either way, the commander on the ground, the person making those decisions, has a lot to bear on their conscience going forward. So I know I'm making up an example here to talk through, and maybe it's not fitting, or if you don't like the example, cool. The challenge here is there were not specific examples given throughout this article. They talk very broadly, and the gaps that they left made it to where you can interpret it a couple different ways. And I think a lot of this, and we'll get into this here in a second, is standard military practice. But when you leave out some of the details, again, it makes it sound awful. So they say, in practice, a terrorist is anyone the IDF has killed in the areas in which its forces operate, says a reserve officer who has served in Gaza. All right, so that insinuation there is that anybody that IDF kills is in turn labeled a terrorist. That's a problem. There have been cases in warfare throughout history where you could arguably make that case. Gaza is not one of them. The fact that somebody exists around Israeli forces in Gaza does not automatically make them a terrorist. If that is, or does not automatically associate them with Hamas in any way, shape, or form. If that is happening, that is a problem. They say the combat zone is a key term. This is an area where a force sets itself up, usually in an abandoned house, with the area surrounding it becoming a closed military area, but with no clear markings as such. Another term for such areas is kill zones. They say this means clear red lines where no one is not from the IDF may cross, so that our forces in the area are not hit. The boundaries of these kill zones are not determined in advance, nor is their distance from the house in which the forces are situated. As soon as people are in it, according to a reserve officer, mainly adult males, orders are to shoot and kill, even if that person is unarmed. In contrast to claims being made, the IDF does not have defined kill zones. This is coming from a statement from the IDF. Support for this comes from the fact that the IDF has arrested a large number of terrorists or suspects during the fighting without inflicting damage in intense combat zones. And the article did cede that there is no written order regarding a kill zone in the IDF standard operating procedures, but it doesn't mean that the concept is unknown to soldiers operating on the battlefield. All right, so this is one where I think there's a mix in the reporting to where there's a misunderstanding of standard military operating procedure, but also a suggestion that Israel is taking it to an extreme in some cases, which would be a problem. So what they're describing here with these kill zones is essentially a strong point, right? So strong pointing buildings in Gaza. So an Israeli force moves into a new area of the battlefield, contested area. They set up shop in an abandoned building or a home, put machine guns in the windows, set up a perimeter, so on and so forth, and they base operations out of there for a period of time. That's normal, and it's the kind of decision you make on the ground as a soldier, which building is going to be best suited to serve as that strong point. So the idea that these, quote, kill zones aren't predetermined before the arrival to those buildings, that's normal. That's to be expected. Once you get on site and you set up your forces, you're able to assess the area, find out where are the likely enemy avenues of approach, what do the fields of fire look like, where do you plan to get your supplies from? Where can the enemy observe you from? All of those things are determined once you have established the strong point. So the idea that this is not established ahead of time is actually normal. It's also normal, unfortunately, especially in a war zone where the enemy is wearing civilian clothing, to have a point where you have to engage with lethal force to protect your own people. So Fortunately, Hamas has not used suicide vests in this current war. They have in the past, and that's certainly on the mind of a lot of Israeli forces. And of course, there have been multiple stabbing attacks carried out by Hamas and other militants throughout the West Bank and Gaza. So that kind of thing is going to be very front and center in the mindset of any Israeli forces operating in Gaza. Now, this article doesn't give any distances when it comes to these kill zones. So again, I'm going to make one up to give some ideas of context here, but it's realistic to say that if you're in the middle of a war zone and somebody is running at you, that by the time they get to the 5-meter mark, you're going to have to engage with lethal force. Now, the hope is that before they get to that 5-meter mark, there's multiple warnings, if you will. The article says that there are no signs, no visible markings. That's not crazy, depending on the kind of outpost or strong point they're setting up. Those would likely be known to the Israeli forces. But what you would have as civilians, because this isn't an ambush, unless that part just isn't being reported, this is not Israeli forces going out there trying to be quiet and ambush civilians as they move through. So what you would expect with any military is before those lethal shots are fired at, in this example, 5 meters, very close, right? There would be loudspeakers, signs. Again, doesn't sound like signs are being used here. You could just shout, stop, turn around, don't come here. Maybe even warning shots fired in the air, at the ground, somewhere near the approaching person before that final step is taken to use lethal force. Again, it's the kind of the nature of this type of low-intensity conflict, counterinsurgency warfare. In Iraq and Afghanistan, a lot of times we would have cones, signs, barbed wire that we could string out quickly, interpreters placed forward to warn the civilians. But again, there is a point in these strong points where you can't have civilians in any way, shape, or form just walking through your perimeter. So there is going to be a point, no matter what, where it's open fire and kill the person that has now entered. On the other hand, if these kill zones, if you will, are out 500 meters in every direction, that's a problem. That's not realistic. That's borderline just calling Gaza a free fire zone, right? In an area that's that densely populated, somebody 500 meters away definitely could pose a threat to Israeli forces. No doubt Hamas has the capability to strike from that distance, but it is unrealistic that in a combat situation like Israel is facing in Gaza, to say that anything in 500 meters in any direction is going to get killed automatically, that's a problem. That's illegal and probably falls into the camp of deliberately targeting civilians. That is not. So again, a key aspect missing from this article. What do those kill zones look like? Because at a very short distance, it's realistic and a standard operating procedure for militaries all around the world. If it's out 500 plus meters, that's extreme and something that needs to seriously be looked into. They say when the general staff realized that the rules of engagement in Gaza are subject to interpretation by local commanders, the chief of staff came out in the clearest manner against the killing of anyone entering a combat zone. He talked about this in his speeches, says the official. Regrettably, there are still commanders, even senior ones, who do as they please in their conduct in the Gaza Strip. If we identified someone in our area of operations, this is coming from another soldier, who is not a part of our forces, we were told to shoot to kill, said a soldier from a reserve brigade in describing his experience. We were explicitly told that even if a suspect runs into a building with people in it, we should fire at the building and kill the terrorist, even if other people are hurt. So this lack of consistent rules of engagement just isn't good. And it sounds like this is not just coming from, again, when you talk to the individual soldiers, they're all kind of giving different examples. I have also heard examples from Israeli soldiers talking about how they've had to hold their fire because some of these Hamas militants are so close to Gazan civilians, which is in stark contrast to what this guy says here of, look, even if they run into a crowd of civilians, they're going to get shot at. This vast difference, lack of consistency in rules of engagement, is not good. It adds confusion, not just to the soldiers on the ground as they're entering theater, if you will, Gaza. They don't understand exactly what the rules of engagements are. That needs to be drilled home to the soldiers. They have a split second to make these life or death decisions, and it needs to be drilled in constantly and well ahead of time to where they know when and how they can engage with lethal force. You can't have soldiers, anybody in a war zone, trying to make that massive decision and run all these calculations in their head of who said what I could do, and is this a place I can shoot or not, or should I fire? That can't be a part of the situation, and not having consistent rules of engagement makes that even murkier, and it's a problem. Not to add, not having consistent rules of engagement from the top down makes it to where Israeli policymakers and military officials might think that one thing is happening on the ground, and then they get out to the field and find out that commanders, low, mid-level commanders, are making different decisions. What if the top-down directive from the IDF is that you will only engage if you have positive identification of a weapon and your forces are coming under fire? And then you get down on the ground and you've got some local commander saying, like what this guy said, even if they run into a group of people, we're going to open fire. Those are vastly different. Those are going to turn the war in vastly different ways, right? So you have to have that consistency in rules of engagement, which shouldn't be a shock really to anyone in the military, past or present. And based off of what the chief of staff said here, it sounds like something that Israel wants. They're just in the process of trying to get to that. And then a last note on the rules of engagement piece here, that can change, and it's going to be different in different war zones. It's going to be different based off of certain operations, where the forces are operating, maybe the type of force conducting that operation. So rules of engagement can be flexible based on the operating environment, but there's got to be some base level of understanding, or it's just going to add confusion all around. So that's essentially a quick rundown of the article. I'll link it in the description below if interested in reading it. Again, I just pulled out a few aspects that I thought were worth talking through. There's a lot more to it than what I discussed. Again, some of the big kind of takeaways from my end here, you have to make sure to not take individual accounts as standard practice across a battlefield, no matter what side or direction you're looking at any conflict from. However, there are some aspects in here that I think were just not understood as standard military practice. The other side of that is they could be deliberately taken out of context, which wouldn't be good. But either way, there's also some individual examples where even if it's just a one-off scenario, that's going to be a problem, right? Things like individual commanders setting up their own ROE, or saying that everybody in our area is a terrorist, whether they have any association with Hamas or are posing any sort of threat to IDF. Those things, even if they're happening in like a one-off situation, that one-off situation is a problem. So again, it's an interesting article. Check it out if interested, but that's what I got for now. Thanks for watching, and I'll see y'all next time.